Mornings with Will on 531 PI.
It is 8:31. This is Pacific Mornings on 531 PI. I'm William Terite. Great to have your company this Thursday. Now, a study commissioned by the Reserve Bank highlights barriers preventing some groups from opening bank accounts. Now, it found that recent migrants, rural communities, the elderly, people with disabilities, and Māori trusts face the most challenges. A third of frontline bank staff reported struggling to open accounts for some customers regularly as well. Joining me for more on this is the Reserve Bank's Tom Bayliss. Very good morning to you.
Tēnā William. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you very much for coming on. Look, before we dig into the nitty-gritty, perhaps some highlights from this research, if you don't mind starting off there.
Absolutely. So one of the key highlights for me was that opening a bank account is just much harder than it needs to be. So the research digs into the underlying reasons, the scale of the problem, the underlying reasons, some of the inclusive practices that are already working to help customers open bank accounts, and then opportunities where there's need for short-term changes and then long-term shifts to ensure that everyone can open a bank account if they want to.
Got you. It kind of begs the question, as soon as I saw this, what are some of the barriers that people like our Pacific community are facing?
So some of the barriers that were highlighted, one of them was around just getting into a bank branch and getting an appointment. So the research highlights some of the figures around the decline in bank branches around the country, but also in opening hours. It also highlights that the efforts that people have to go to prove their identity in terms of proof of address, proof of ID, are huge barriers for some customer groups, particularly for recent migrants. 53% of frontline staff reported that recent migrants were one of the groups that were most likely to be impacted. And so for those customers, being able to prove where you live and provide a source of an ID was a barrier. And it could be a barrier that if you're moving to a new country, setting up your lives, you need a bank account to pay for the rent or get established, but you need a proof of address or a proof of tenancy agreement to then get a bank account. So there's kind of these circular requirements that mean people find themselves locked out of being able to open a bank account.
Sure. Why does it, particularly from what the research states, why is it recent migrants, rural communities, the elderly, people with disabilities, Māori trusts, and Pacific communities, why is it that particular cohort?
There's a broad range of groups that were impacted. Some frontline staff said it was hard to highlight a particular group. It affects kind of a lot of different people in different circumstances. The reason it affects some groups more is really about their circumstances and whether they're able to get the documents they need. For example, young people in care was one example. To be able to track down a birth certificate, you may not have parental support as well. So there are particular groups where providing those documents is tricky. And the approach that frontline staff took was quite variable. So we found inconsistent practices as well. So one frontline staff might have very prescriptive requirements that they may have to have a passport, whereas another staff member might have a more flexible approach where they're able to find alternative ways of making it work. But I think overall, one of the concerns around and why different groups are impacted is around risk appetite. So 3/4 of frontline staff said they have to take a very cautious approach to onboarding. So there's a lot of pressure that if you make mistakes, there can be some repercussions. So it's easier for frontline staff in some cases just to, if they don't have the right documents, to say no and turn that customer away and ask them to reply.
Look, this is a very loaded question, and I'm sure you'll have stop me if I'm wrong here, but it does beg the question, is there a bit of profiling to this or not at all?
It's something that we didn't ask about in the research.
Cool.
So it's not something that was highlighted as part of the research, but in terms of those communities, we did a kaupapa Māori strand of the research, and that asked about particular impacts for Māori communities. And we looked at Māori trusts, and they talked about some of the high levels of scrutiny that they feel that they have to, that they experience in an onboarding process. So that can be proving who they are, but not just for one trustee, for many. Sure. But also they talked about some of the distrust that they have around financial institutions, and actually the kind of going into a bank branch can be a process where it's not necessarily a mana-enhancing experience if you're told no. You need a bank account for your daily lives, for your payments. You need it to support your whānau trust or something like that. So getting told no, or having to go through long processes to prove where you get your money from, these processes can be a barrier as well for particular communities, as you said, as you highlight.
Well put. With that in mind, then, I mean, kind of ultimately, what are the solutions that could be suggested to get on top of this? I mean, to improve, say, trust with financial institutions.
Yeah, the research highlights a couple of areas for action. So one of them is around basic bank accounts. So that is looking at how the process could be simplified in a streamlined onboarding process. So a basic bank account may have some restrictions in terms of the amount of money that can be held in it, but it has you can go through a process without any forms of ID or address to open those bank accounts really quickly and straightforward, so you can get access to your money straight away. Another area is around data. So we're collecting better information on access to bank accounts. This area around the number of declined applications hasn't really been tracked particularly well so far. So we're looking at how we can improve that. And then finally, just in terms of guidance. So there are some really good practices out there that exist. One example is for a recent migrant delaying the use of verification so that they can start getting their money straight away. So guidance around those inclusive practices and trying to clarify how banks can do this in a really efficient way.
Yeah, look, I think a problem perhaps for our Pacific community as well is obviously around language barriers. Did this research pick that up too? And are there perhaps solutions to try and bridge that gap as well?
That's right. So 51% of staff talked about language barriers being an issue for them that impacted their ability to open accounts for customers. So I think it is an issue. Some of the practices we heard were around having translation services and having extra care teams that were dedicated towards supporting customers if that particular frontline staff member wasn't able to help that customer. So there are some kind of leading practices in that case. It would be great to see more of that. I think it's definitely an area for improvement.
Yeah, for sure. And let's dig in a wee bit deeper here. I mean, how can community organizations and I guess banks work together to remove those barriers to financial inclusion for Māori and Pacific communities? Is there actually that need for more collaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on there with that collaboration. There are some community organisations out there that have been highlighting this issue. Financial Mentors are one, FinCat.
Yes.
Community Networks Aotearoa, the community network that works with trusts and charitable trusts, they have a report that came out last year on this issue. And I think in engaging with the banks, they've been quite a constructive input, real interest in looking at how these processes can be improved. So I think that need for collaboration is a really good point.
Look, it would be remiss of me not to ask the central bank this, but how much did this cost to commission?
Oh, it was value for money. It was 100,000. It was a really important piece of research. So yeah, I think the impact and the value that it has goes far beyond that total cost for the research. So yeah, really keen to see those actions and next steps come forward and improve outcomes for New Zealanders.
Yeah, final question for you. And often when we get people on and we talk about new research that's, has substantial findings such as this one of my concerns is we get this research and then not a lot happens. It's just life goes on. How can you ensure that this will actually lead to tangible outcomes? Because like you said, it is bang for buck, which is great that we've got this, but how do we actually get cemented evidence that this will genuinely lead to better outcomes?
That's a really good question. In terms of the engagement we have with banks, I think we are starting to see progress, but one of the areas that we'll be leaning into is this concept of a basic bank account. And this is a tool that a lot of countries overseas have used, and a lot of Pacific countries have engaged on basic bank accounts and bank accounts as well. So it's the idea that regardless of someone's social circumstances, their technical expertise, their abilities, regardless of all of those factors, they should be entitled to a basic bank account. And so changing the emphasis that a bank account is something that someone's only entitled to have if they can meet X, Y, Z criteria, but shifting that to say that everyone's entitled to a basic bank account, regardless of their personal circumstances. So that's the benefit of this work that's coming up, and we'll be consulting in April with the Council of Financial Regulators on a basic bank account to really hope to shift the dial in the space.
Happy days indeed. I always love when we can get the Reserve Bank on the show. I always treat OCR Day as my Christmas day. So thank you very much. You have a good rest of your day. That is Tom Bayliss, Reserve Bank's Financial Inclusion Principal Advisor. You have a good rest of your day, eh?
You too, Will. Thanks a lot.